everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for another new episode of Season 2 of Revise and Resubmit. I'm Dr. Kim Bissell, the Southern Progress Endowed Professor in Magazine Journalism and the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Communication and Information Sciences at the University of Alabama.
And I'm Dr. Annalisa Bowen, an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies, also at the University of Alabama, and we both work in the Institute for Communication and Information Research, or the ICIR, at UA. So, Kim, I have to say, one of the really cool things about talking to our guests is that they're not just professors or faculty at the University of Alabama. They've had so many other experiences that have led them to being faculty and have shaped what they teach and the way they teach and their research. And I think that learning about these experiences is pretty interesting. And once I hear these stories, I'm like, oh, okay. So now I understand you more now. And then I think back to my own past and how does that shape me? I've been a preschool teacher. Yikes. And I mean, they're awfully cute, but yikes. And I made it in retail once. Like 3 months in retail, and then I had to quit before I was fired. You've been a journalist and a photographer. Any other interesting jobs that you've had that have shaped your experiences as a professor?
I've had a few. I think I've had a few jobs in my day that have really made me appreciate the fact that I'm a professor. I've also had a very short stint in food service. Terrible. Just nice. Really, really terrible all the way around. And the very glamorous job of delivering pizza while I was in college. Talk about fun times there. So I think my professional work as a photojournalist has given me the skill set to be a professor of journalism. And even though all of that happened in the days of dark rooms and print newspapers, it definitely kind of shaped who I was once I started teaching students all about it. And obviously, to be a photographer, there are a number of skills that are involved, and you have to be somewhat creative. So I think at the time I considered myself to be an artist, but I'll tell you what, I never thought of myself as a drawer.
Yeah. So drawing, okay, so it takes so much talent. Indeed. And right? I mean, not only the skills of your hand moving and making something intelligible on the paper, but also creativity and wit in what is actually drawn. And thinking about whether it will be understood by a larger audience.
So true. If you've ever looked at an editorial cartoon, if you remember back to those days, found these on the editorial page of the newspaper, I know sometimes I wondered, who gets this job? Or how do you get to draw cartoons for a living? Have you ever wondered about the news stories that we see and the decisions that are made about the stories that are selected and what stories aren't? So our next guest has all the answers and more. Our next guest actually had all of those jobs when he was working professionally in the news industry. And it's those experiences that really shaped what he does now as a professor of journalism.
Today we are joined by a professor in the Department of Journalism and Creative Media, and this is one that you don't want to miss. Dr. Wilson Lowry, he's not only a professor, but he has been an editorial cartoonist at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And I mean, I can't fathom doing that at all.
I know.
And we're going to learn more about his professional work in the news and how that's guided the questions that he now asks as a researcher. And we'll learn more about his work in the area of sociology of news, basically the decisions that shape the way news comes together.
Join us today as we talk with Dr. Wilson Lowry about his very cool travel experiences as a graduate student to breaking down the research he's doing now that has us thinking about the news that we see. So we want to extend a very warm welcome to Dr. Wilson Lowry. Thanks so much for joining us today, Wilson.
Sure.
So before we get into some of our real research questions, Wilson, I do remember you telling me several years ago about a trip you took to Fiji or someplace like that. And this was all for, I'm using air quotes here, research. How in the world did you wind up halfway around the world in the middle of the Pacific doing research?
Well, there was some research to this. Really, actually, really what it was when I was a PhD student, and a lot of it was actually training. It was this training and research center at University of Georgia. My advisor, Lee Becker, ran it, and he would travel all over the world and run these things. So he had a pretty nice gig doing that. And so, yeah, I don't know how I got lucky enough to fall into a time period when he was like focusing on the South Pacific. So, but that's just the year or two I was working with him. Yeah, we traveled down there and did this training for journalists from all over these little islands all over the South Pacific, and they flew into Fiji. And so I taught newspaper design for like 2 days for these folks. And the interesting thing, one thing was, this is going on too long, but we were going in there with some research purposes, like trying to figure out how their culture might shape the way they thought about design and so forth. So we had we had this session planned initially where we would do this kind of qualitative research with them. And ultimately the journalists just got all frustrated, and they were just like, can you just please tell us how to design papers like USA Today? So it was kind of an eye opener for, okay. Yeah. Wow. But yeah, that was a good experience. And we were on the non-tourist side of the island, by the way. There is an unglamorous section of Fiji. So I was not lying on the beach.
Sipping Mai Tais. Well, thank you for that. I just thought that would be fun for people to hear about.
Oh yeah.
So Wilson, can you tell our listeners just briefly about who you are and where you're from?
I'm from Atlanta, so I'm a Southerner of sorts. Some people would say Atlantans aren't Southerners, but both my parents are from small towns in the South, and now I live in a pretty small town in the South. But so I grew up there, and one thing I've always done a lot throughout my life is illustrating and cartooning. So that was actually my first job in media work, was doing illustrations, and I was an editorial cartoonist. But I went into work in newspapers for a while, and just sort of thought after a while really enjoyed it. But after I was getting kind of pushed into middle management, and I thought, I'd always thought I enjoyed doing research when I was a master's student. I had already gotten my master's degree in journalism at that point. And so I just decided to go back and go that direction. And I've never looked back.
It's very cool.
Yeah.
So could you give us an elevator pitch of your research?
Yeah, I'll try. I'm terrible at elevator pitches, but this is not a skill of mine. And I'm 57. It's not going to get any better. But basically, I researched the forces and factors that shape news media, or the production of news media. So this is the other side of media research. A lot of what's done is the effects from media, and I look at the back side of that, or the front side of that, whatever side it is. And I think most recently I've been focusing on what I call social space approaches to journalism, where it really focuses on both, I guess, the structures, the kind of social and political and economic structures that shape journalism, while also allowing for agency, so journalists and managers and news outlets can actually act, and they're not prisoners to the structure, to their situations. And it's these kind of approaches are really good for that. So it leads to some interesting stuff, and the reasons that journalists do things. In part they're constrained, in part they're seeking resources, but they're also seeking stuff like legitimacy and identity. And so this leads to some really weird and interesting stuff, when you kind of combine all that. So
So if you
well, that was a terrible elevator speech.
No.
No, that was good.
It wasn't. It wasn't at all, and it leads us into kind of so we're going to ask you to go from the kind of decision making side to the creative side here for just a second, and can you come up with a headline for one of your more interesting findings?
Yeah. So here's one. For journalists, the best surprise is no surprise.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. Tell us more.
Yeah, I have no idea. I just sort of made that up. I don't know what it means. No, it's I think it's a little counterintuitive because you think of journalists craving surprise, and so I don't at all mean that journalists don't like a surprising event in the world or something that looks different or strange or grabs attention. Those are sort of essential news values, but it's more in terms of partly because of that unexpected nature of the journalist world. They kind of have to control it, and so there is a important aspect of journalism where they're seeking stability in the day-to-day practice of it, routinization and institutionalization of forms, new forms that come along. Because the other part of journalism now is that it's so disrupted that there's so many, everybody knows there are economic problems and crisis and credibility, and we're the enemy of the people, and according to our president, so there's a lot of bad stuff going on in the journalism field, and that's led to a lot of need for change, and it's become kind of a accepted mantra in the journalism field that it's always we're supposed to throw things up against the wall and see what sticks in terms of new ways of doing journalism or new business models or whatever. But all that also kind of encourages this craziness in the field, and so it's what I often look at is just because I'm ornery and I always go against the common way of thinking about things, which I think is one of the inspirational things for me in doing research, but is really looking at how not different, or how much things like mimicry play an important role in changes in the field. Or how journalists and news organizations will say they're making change and being progressive in terms of pursuing the future of journalism and all this, but then they end up kind of doing the same old thing, and so they change in a window dressing kind of way, kind of superficially. So-called loose coupling in the organizational studies area. So those sorts of things are kind of interesting to me. So I guess that's where the best surprise is no surprise comes from.
I like it.
So Wilson, something that you had just said is that it's kind of a tough time to be in the journalism industry right now. And the research you've been doing this for a good bit of time. I won't date you too much, but a good bit of time. So
a couple of years.
Just a few. So what I'm curious about is if you're studying kind of the front end of it, the content, the creation of the content. Certainly, let's just say the last decade or two, we've seen so many changes. How has that affected what you study, how you approach what you study, and then what you found? And I know that's 3 questions that could have very long answers, and I'm sorry.
Yeah. So how did all the changes kind of affect my research? Yep. Is that yeah? Well, it gives me got a lot of raw material. I guess. One thing, I don't know if this is quite what you're looking for, but one thing I think I've seen very recently is there's so much problem, so much trouble that journalists, I think some of these changes are having more staying power, or they're actually sinking in a little bit deeper. Whereas I was saying things are superficial, and that is kind of the first go-to for journalists and news or any organization. I think they kind of tend to want to do things the same old way, but there's so much desperation that I think you are beginning to really see change in a consequential way that I think you maybe saw is mostly a rhetorical change for a while. So that's been one change. I guess the increasing desperation has led to some things like one thing I'm looking at right now are these local news collaborations, which have become really, really popular all over the country, where news organizations, foundations, nonprofits, all kinds of groups are coming together, and universities, and creating these collaborative arrangements and doing investigative journalism or different kinds of projects, especially at the local level where a lot of the problems are. And it's really amazing to see these things take off. And some of them are they're seeking some permanence in these things. So some of them are beginning to stabilize. And there's a couple, like there's one in Philadelphia that is really kind of becoming a new kind of journalistic organization, a collaborative arrangement that's kind of informed by a innovation center at the organization. So they try new things, and they have all these different news organizations that are part of this collaborative and doing all these things. But it seems to be an ongoing thing. It's not just running a couple of years and then ending. So I don't know. I guess if what I said is just true, I might have to change my headline. What I said a minute ago.
No,
but we'll see.
No, that was.
I still think the default is, can we please get back to doing things the way we were doing them? Yeah,
for sure.
When you conduct your studies, what kind of methods do you use?
Yeah, I use a lot of different kinds of methods. I think I've probably gravitated a little more toward empirical qualitative methods over the years. But where I find myself doing more in-depth interviews and observation work. So I don't do rhetorical research really, but it's not my area, but it's just what I call it empirical qualitative. But I definitely use surveys. Certainly a good bit of content analysis. It's kind of so. I think increasingly I like the idea part of research. I really get juiced by sort of the conceptual end of it, and coming and kind of putting together ideas and crafting rationale for new ways of thinking about things. And so I think the qualitative research lends itself to that, I guess. Plus a lot of the literature I use comes out of sociology, and a lot of that stuff is qualitative, kind of observations of newsrooms and in-depth work. But having said that, yes, I definitely use quantitative approaches as well.
So I like hearing that you do these in-depth interviews, and my question to follow that up with is, so journalists are the ones who ask the questions, right? So how are journalists at being asked?
Yeah, that's a great question. It can be a little intimidating at times because not intimidating, but it sometimes you run into journalists who are critiquing your question. And so the thing is, it's like, they don't know what your aims are. They don't know that you're trying to get at some concepts in your research, and this is your exemplar, kind of to get at that. And so the questions you ask are kind of be a little bit different from a journalistic interview. But I have run into that before, where it's like, and I think journalists too really value getting to the point quickly. That's a value for them, kind of a work value, and so that sometimes those two things don't always go together.
So Wilson, I know you are a co-author on a recently published book, Russian Regional Journalism: Struggle and Survival in the Heartland. So and first, congratulations on that.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
Second, I'm wondering if you can talk to our listeners a little bit about, it's obviously a very involved research project. How do you stay positive, like, over the process, and how do you manage the project over time?
Yeah.
And if bourbon's the answer, that's okay.
And what's that?
If bourbon's the answer, that's okay.
Oh, bourbon. That does not help me focus. Yeah. But, honestly, when I have an in-depth project, I mean, you always have something like a book project. You get to, at some point, you're getting to like editing. And I actually never mind editing that much, but you do get things can get a little tedious toward the end. But in a project, a really involved project, I don't have trouble staying positive, because I think the project just kind of pulls me along. So I think my struggle is like multitasking, like stopping doing that and doing something else, which of course you're always having to do. And so I can just get really immersed in something like that. And I think that's what, that's kind of how I end up, to the degree that I am productive, and can be marginally productive, or I can be somewhat productive, but it's just sort of losing myself and stuff, and so that I'm there I am at 10 o'clock at night, and on, this is going to sound depressing, but like on Friday or Saturday night or something, not every Friday or Saturday night, but I sort of, and I'm still working on this, and so that doesn't always happen, but yeah, I mean, as far as being positive, I guess, I think honestly, it's like the deeper the project, probably the less problem that is for me. Wow. In a way, because I just sort of, I guess I'm able to really connect my own thinking with, concepts from the literature, and that's just a satisfying and meaningful kind of thing for me to do. So I don't know. Yeah.
How long did it take to kind of from conception to publishing? How long did the book project take?
Yeah, well, we first started talking about doing this book, boy, like 5 or 6 years ago. Wow. And at the time we had 10 years worth of research.
Wow.
And so we thought, okay, we were coming up on 10 years. We're coming up on a decade's worth of research on this province. And then we added a couple of other provinces, that ended up being 3. And then it just took we just kind of kept not doing it, or planning. And then, it kind of come and go. But we got serious about it, I guess, a few years ago, and started talking to some publishers and thinking about how we wanted to do it. So, I mean, I guess a couple of years, just from the point of really talking to publishers, and then, you produce some chapters for them. And we had already kind of outlined a general plan for it. But in the meantime, we kept researching. And so, we were adding stuff. So.
Can you talk to our listeners a little bit about the application of your research?
Yeah. And so can you, in terms of how do you want me to answer that? I'm not, like, how it applies to the everyday, to its practical implications?
Yeah.
Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Practical.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There are none. No, I like the theory and the concepts, right? I like to float off into the ether. No, I think for me, what, having worked in journalism for years, one of the ththings that I saw was some of the things that I ended up researching, the problem areas, like initially the thing that I researched a lot, and I researched this in my dissertation, was conflict among subgroups in news organizations. So the idea that there were, I had published a piece of word people versus picture people. And and sort of the idea there was that these different groups actually were sort of sub occupations, so visual journalists were connected with journalism, but they were also connected with graphic arts and other disciplines and knowledge areas. And so if you think about occupations as being kind of at a more abstract level above the organization, these subgroups within organizations actually had connections to different occupations at this higher order level, and so the F there, so that caused some differences in kind of that their norms and values and certainly practices that led to some conflict within the organization. Anyway, that I think things like that are more easily sort of demonstrable to how they have practical implications. In fact, I wrote some pieces for trade publications, and I spoke to some journalism groups about some of this research, presented findings. So since then, though, I've gotten a little more abstract or a little more macro in the things that I'm looking at. So I'm looking at sort of broader institutional issues and so forth. And I think so that's not immediately as I think practically applicable on a daily basis, or it's not as easy to see how it is. But I think what I end up looking at now is sort of blind areas of journalism that are hard to see, kind of latent stuff, latent problems that are hard to see when you're just looking at the daily, everyday world of journalism. And so I think when I have talked with journalists and so forth, I sort of gear it toward, here are some danger areas or some problem areas or some hidden motivations and reasons that some of these things are happening, where there's struggles and say innovating or trying to adapt innovations to a news organization or something like that. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I think that's sort of, helping the scale fall from people's eyes or revealing, kind of pulling back the curtain on some things, is I guess more on the practical application of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So shifting gears just a little bit, can you tell us about an experience you've had with revising and resubmitting and maybe even persisting? I know we have a lot of people listening who, maybe going through that for the first time, and it's kind of devastating to get a rejection or you get a letter from the editor that's like, okay, just change everything you've done, collect data again, and you'll be fine. Can you tell us about one of your experiences?
I guess, the one that pops to mind, just this in terms of bad experiences, is, I think, there was an incident. It was when I was with my first, not long after coming out of the PhD program, and I was at Mississippi State, and it was a journal of communication piece, I remember, and the editor there were significant changes, substantial changes. In fact, it was even it wasn't data collection, but it was some pretty hefty reanalysis and stuff. And so, but the editor was positive and encouraging, and so I spent a lot of time on this, and the editor said, I think the response was sort of, you've addressed a lot of the problem areas here, but we just aren't going to be able to. And it just was never clear to me, why that was. And this is, I don't, this is that one always just sort of, was maybe because it was early on, it stuck with me. But plus it's pretty unusual, when you have. I felt sort of like there were mixed messages, from the initial letter to the second letter, and it could have been some, and I think if it was something I'd done wrong, I wanted to know, but it was also a bit vague. So I don't know what happened. I felt like something happened behind the scenes or something. I don't know. That was always odd, but generally, I feel like I've had pretty good experiences. I've led with a negative there. But really, I mean, I've had very helpful editors, very helpful reviewers, and many publications. I usually, you can usually think of a way to meet folks halfway, if nothing else. And,
well, and you didn't let that first experience deter you from continuing in the research process.
Yeah. And I think, I'd been able to publish elsewhere. And so it wasn't like, devastating, but it was just always sort of, I guess happening early on, it sort of puts you on, it makes you aware that things may not always go the way you think they're going to go.
Yes. So Wilson, finally, we'll shift gears just a little bit more. As academics, we have the good fortune of being able to travel to different countries or different cities around the U.S. for conferences and to present research. What's one of the favorite places that you have visited when you have traveled to present your research, or that you're looking forward to going?
No. The first thing that occurs to me is my family. We took a family trip to Turkey years ago, and I went back. There was a conference in Istanbul, and I went to Lee Becker, my major. I had done a paper with him. It's the last thing I did with him, and then another piece with Alina, who's my co-author of the Russia book, and then I had a third piece I had at this conference in Istanbul. But I brought my son, my younger son, with me. And I always think that was a really good, it was just a kind of a special time to spend with him too. And he sat in on the sessions. Which was just, he was 14, I think. But he was so cool with it. I just remember, that was kind of a neat experience, looking out and then seeing Wes sitting there in the back of the room and seemingly paying attention. And he even had like a critique for me, and he had to listen to me practice,
That's awesome.
But we had, it was neat to also get after all that was done, to get a chance to see the place. And then we both got sick right before we came home, so that wasn't so great. But anyway. Still, I don't think about that. I think about the fond memories of that trip. But, and then, as far as the other thing is, I think I really, there's a lot of places that I've enjoyed going, even just kind of pedestrian kind of seeming places. Sometimes if you get out and you see some cool things, just kind of, I just mean places that, are not that far off, or, a Chicago or a Nashville or something. If I haven't been there, then, I always find something interesting. So I don't have to go halfway around the world, though I don't object to that.
Wilson, it has been such a pleasure to talk to you today, and we certainly appreciate you sharing your experiences as a researcher and a scholar with us and our listeners. So thank you so much for joining us today.
I had a really good time.
Thanks, Wilson.
Okay. Take care.